Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series on Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies with our first read in Chapter 7, which is entitled Third World Facts and Fallacies. As I've mentioned throughout the course of this series, we are doing this series as a parallel read with Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, so I'll put a link in this video's description to that series so you can follow along there as well. As I've also mentioned throughout the course of this series, we will be doing an analysis and review at the end of each read, so I'll put a timestamp in this video's description so you can jump straight to the analysis and review if that's how you'd like to go about things. Finally, before we get started here, Sowell breaks up this chapter into several sections and then into several subsections. So I'll let you know when we get to those section and subsection breaks, and I'll put timestamps for each of those in this video's description as well so you can follow along a little easier. So without further ado, let's dive on into tonight's read, which will begin Chapter 7, Third World Facts and Fallacies. Contrast between the prosperity of various Western nations and the dire poverty of some third world countries arouse many emotions and provoke many inquiries into how such things can be. While such inquiries have turned up many facts, a failure to distinguish between causation and blame has produced many fallacies. Since virtually unlimited numbers of sins can be found in the history of any branch of the human race, there will seldom be a lack of bad episodes that can be cited by those who seek to explain causation by blame. A book title captured much of this confusion: How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Europeans certainly committed many sins in Africa, and North Africans committed not a few sins in Europe. North Africa's Barbary Coast pirates alone enslaved more Europeans than there were Africans taken in bondage to the United States, and North Africa's Moors invaded and subjugated Spain for centuries. Such depredations and atrocities were by no means confined to Europeans and Africans. Asians, Arabs, Polynesians, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere all show a history very similar in this respect, in its broad outlines, however much it differs in specific details from one part of the world to another. The confusion between blame and causation is likewise not confined to issues involving Europeans and Africans. Many blame the poverty in South America on North Americans, or the poverty of India on British colonial rule in that subcontinent. Sometimes, of course, blame and causation may coincide, just as a historic event may coincide with the spring equinox. But they are still two different things despite such overlap. Spanish conquerors destroyed many indigenous economies and societies in the Western Hemisphere in the course of building a vast empire that stretched from the southern tip of South America all the way up to San Francisco, enriching Spain and impoverishing the indigenous populations of these regions. But despite similar examples that could be cited in various parts of the world, the more fundamental question remains: is that why most prosperous countries today are prosperous, and why most poor countries are poor? How could the conquerors have conquered in the first place unless there were significant differences beforehand, whether economic, military, or whatsoever, between them and the conquered? Such questions are especially important when trying to explain how a country like Spain, not as large as Texas, could conquer territories many times its own size, with populations vastly outnumbering Spaniards, or how a number of European countries could do the same in Africa, or Japan do the same in East Asia in the first half of the 20th century. In short, even those who blame conquerors for the poverty of the conquered have still not disposed of the question of causation, for the preceding differences behind the conquests themselves remain to be explained. Moreover, there are prosperous countries whose conquests have been minor or non-existent, and countries mired in poverty that were never conquered. If the attempt to make causation synonymous with blame takes the form of blaming economic quote-unquote exploitation, however defined, for the poverty of the third world, the great unanswered question then is, why are those parts of the third world least touched by contact with prosperous nations so often the most destitute of all? Blame is much easier to understand than causation, more emotionally satisfying, and more politically convenient. But it is also a source of many fallacies. The complexities of causation must at least be examined before assuming that blame alone can explain third world poverty. Many of the factors behind economic differences between different regions of the world have their origins in geography, for which neither the rich nor the poor can be blamed. Geography. Geography encompasses many things: the configuration and fertility of the land, climate, natural resources, waterways, flora, and fauna. All restrict or enhance the prospects of economic development, though seldom does any single factor determine the pace or magnitude of development. It might seem strange that the configuration of the land could affect which peoples live in poverty and which achieve prosperity. But as this distinguished French historian Fernand Braudel pointed out as a general rule, quote, "Mountain life persistently lagged behind the plain," end quote. Examples are not hard to find. The poverty and backwardness that long afflicted America's Appalachian region. In earlier centuries, the fact that people in Greece's mountains were the last to learn to speak Greek, just as the Scottish Highlanders did not learn to speak English until after the Scottish Lowlanders did. That the Islamic region reached the people in the Rift Mountains after the people on the land below had already become Muslims. It seems to be more than coincidence that the earliest known civilizations, in the Middle East, in India, and in China, all began in river valleys, and most of the great cities around the world were built on navigable waterways. Although we tend to think of geography as fixed, what human beings can do with a given geographic environment changes over time as knowledge and experience grow, so that the advantages and disadvantages of particular environments, both absolutely and relative to other environments, can change profoundly over time. While the amount of natural resources in a particular environment might be considered to be given, what physical things can in fact function as natural resources depends entirely on what human beings know how to use. Waterfalls were not natural resources, but simply impediments to travel on waterways, before people invented water mills and later hydroelectric dams. Thus, the relative geographic advantages and disadvantages of different regions that had or did not have waterfalls changed, and therefore changed the prospects for prosperity or poverty for the inhabitants of those regions. The presence or absence of petroleum, uranium, or other mineral deposits likewise had entirely different economic effects on the relative prospects of different regions, and their inhabitants before and after ways of using these things became unknown. The heavy soils of Western Europe became more fertile than other soils only after ways were invented to harness horses or oxen so that farmers could effectively plow such soils. Meanwhile, no such developments were possible in the Western Hemisphere for thousands of years because there were no horses or oxen in the Western Hemisphere before the European invaders brought them. In an age when agriculture was the dominant economic activity over most of the planet, this meant that the economies of the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere could not develop in the same way as economies of the vast Eurasian landmass, where the majority of the human race lived. Because horses and oxen were also central to the transport of people and goods in Europe and Asia for thousands of years, this meant that land transport, as well as agriculture, could not be the same in the Western Hemisphere. Moreover, because the economically feasible magnitude of water transport depended on the capacity of land transport to handle cargoes when they reached port, there were not the same incentives and advantages to creating large, ocean-going vessels in the Western Hemisphere as there were in Europe or Asia. In short, whole ways of life had to be different in the two hemispheres because of geographic differences. Perhaps the most profound effect of geography is in facilitating or impeding the interactions of peoples, not only economically, but culturally. Since no one has a monopoly of new insights, the economic or other advancement of any given people depends in part on the extent to which they have access to the advances made by others. Geography plays a critical role in determining how wide the cultural universe extends at any given place. For thousands of years, the peoples of the Eurasian landmass and the peoples of the Western Hemisphere were unaware of each other's existence, so that cultural interchanges were out of the question. The past 5 centuries in which they have been in contact with each other are a small fraction of the history of the human race compared to the very long eras in which they developed and elaborated separate and very different economies, cultures, skills, and values. Similarly, peoples living on isolated islands and seas around the world have been cut off from the cultural interactions necessary to participate in the general advances of the human race. The indigenous people of the Canary Islands were of a Caucasian race, living at a Stone Age level when the Spaniards discovered them in the 15th century. So were the Australian Aborigines on their isolated island continent on the other side of the world before the British arrived. Geographic isolation has had a negative and sometimes devastating impact on economic and cultural development, whether that isolation has been absolute in some cases or relative in others. Geographic differences can impose large differences in transportation costs, which in turn can facilitate cultural interactions among some peoples and inhibit or prevent it for others. Europe and Asia are regarded as separate continents, even though they are on one continuous landmass, because mountains and deserts separate Asians from Europeans, leaving them separate races with major cultural differences for thousands of years. While Europeans and Asians during that era were not separated as absolutely as the peoples of the Eurasian landmass in general were separated from the peoples of the Western Hemisphere, nevertheless, economic interactions between Europeans and Asians were limited by transportation costs, and their cultural interactions still more so, since the transportation and transplantation of human beings is more costly than the shipment of merchandise. The vast Sahara Desert, comparable in size to the 48 contiguous United States, likewise, for thousands of years, separated the peoples of sub-Saharan Africa from the rest of the human race, not absolutely, but to a very significant extent. As Fernand Braudel put it, quote, external influence filtered only very slowly, drop by drop, into the vast African continent south of the Sahara, end quote. Moreover, many and severe internal geographic barriers separated many of the peoples of sub-Saharan Africa from one another, fragmenting the region culturally, one sign of which are the great number of different African languages, 30% of all the languages in the world, from only 13% of the world's population. Wherever people have been isolated, whether by deserts or on distant islands in the sea or in remote mountain valleys, they have tended to lag behind the economic and cultural advances in the wider world. Climate is also part of geography. In addition to the direct advantages and disadvantages of particular climates in terms of agriculture or disease, climate can also affect the size of the cultural universe. People whose lands and waterways are frozen much of the year can seldom maintain trade or communications with the outside world, as well as people in milder climates. Because climates usually vary more from north to south than they do over equal distances from east to west, knowledge of particular crops or domestication and care of particular animals can travel far greater distances from east to west than from north to south. Such knowledge could travel all the way across Asia to places at similar latitudes in Europe, but knowledge of the flora and fauna in the temperate zone in South America could not travel a similar distance to the temperate zone in North America because they are separated by a wide tropical zone, where the flora and fauna were different. Geographic variations can be extreme even within a relatively limited area. Where moisture-laden winds blow across a mountain range, the rainfall on the windward side of those mountains can be several times as large as the rainfall on the leeward side, creating completely different conditions for agriculture on the two sides. Different vegetation also grows at different heights on the same mountains. Western Europe differs from Eastern Europe in climate, navigable waterways, and in the mineral deposits necessary for industrialization, and it differs from Africa in all these respects even more so. The influence of geographic factors cannot be understood by looking at each factor in isolation because their interactions are often crucial. For example, while much of sub-Saharan Africa lacks beasts of burden that are common in Europe and Asia, the isolating effect of this is magnified by the dearth of navigable waterways and, in some places, difficult terrain for travel or transportation. The colorful sight of sub-Saharan Africans carrying large bundles on their heads is a sign of the severe limitations of transport, which have handicapped that region for thousands of years. What might be thought to be a crucial geographic factor in a country's economic fate, the presence or absence of saleable natural resources, turns out to have no such determining effect. Saudi Arabia is not only the world's largest producer of oil, that oil is so accessible that its cost of production is a small fraction of the price at which it sells on the world market. There are some extremely rich Saudis as a result, but for the country as a whole, its real income per capita is approximately half that of Singapore, which has virtually no natural resources except for its harbor, and even has to import its water from Malaysia. Israel, which has no significant amount of oil, has a higher real income per capita than most of the oil-rich Middle East countries. The world's largest producer of natural gas, Russia, is not even among the top 70 nations of the world in real income per capita. Neither is the world's largest producer of rubber, Thailand, or zinc, China. The world's largest producers of gold, South Africa, and copper, Chile, are 69th and 70th respectively in real income per capita. The value of natural resources per capita in Uruguay and Venezuela is several times what it is in Japan or Switzerland, but the real per capita income in Japan and Switzerland is about double that of Uruguay and several times that of Venezuela. Geographic accessibility to the advances of the rest of the world seems to have had more effect on economic development than the possession of rich natural resources. Knowledge is, after all, what makes something a natural resource. The caveman lived amid the same physical resources we have today and had them in greater abundance, but they were not natural resources in any economically meaningful sense until human beings acquired the knowledge to use them and the cultures to organize their use. There is no need here to go into the detailed geography of the third world countries, much less to claim that geography is the sole determinant of their poverty. What is important to understand is to understand that geography alone is enough to preclude any inherent economic sameness or equality among peoples or nations from being used as a benchmark or general presumption that would lead us to be shocked that there are differences and to look for mysterious or sinister reasons for those differences. There are also many other factors at work besides geography which influence the poverty or prosperity of nations. Because of other factors, some geographically very fortunate nations are nevertheless poverty-stricken, and some much less geographically favored nations have prospered. We need to consider these other factors as well, but, again, with no general presumption that peoples and nations around the world would have had the same economic outcomes except for some given factor. History. When we refer to the third world nations, that may give the impression that there is a given set of countries very different from other countries, but that would be a fallacy. A list of either prosperous or poverty-stricken countries 100 years ago would not contain all the same countries as today. As recently as the middle of the 20th century, Singapore would have been among the poorest places on earth, but today is among the richest. Mid-19th century Japan was a poor and backward nation, and as recently as the first half of the 20th century, products made in Japan were usually regarded as poor quality imitations of similar products made in Europe or the United States. Yet today Japan's cars, cameras, and other products have set the standard for quality around the world, and the Japanese people are among the most prosperous. At the beginning of the 20th century, Argentina was one of the 10 most prosperous nations on earth, ahead of Germany or France, but it has long since lost that position. In the long view of history, all nations were third world nations at some point or other in their evolution. In short, what are identified as third world nations today are simply countries whose economic levels lag behind those of most other countries. Some have always been poor, and some have become poor, either absolutely or relative to rising living standards around the world. Some, such as China and India, have for some centuries been very poor, but have, within the past generation or so, had unusually rapid economic growth rates that have lifted many millions of their people above these countries' official poverty lines. Within an even shorter span of time, the composition of the group of poorest nations has changed. As economist William Easterly has pointed out, quote, 11 out of the 28 poorest countries in 1985 were not in the poorest fifth back in 1950, end quote. As noted in Chapter 5, comparing the relative incomes of statistical categories over time produces very different results from comparing the relative incomes of the same human beings over time. Likewise, comparing statistical categories of nations over time produces very different results from those of comparing the same nations over time. The World Bank, among others, has produced statistics showing that the ratio between the incomes of the 20 highest income countries and the 20 lowest income countries has grown over the period from 1960 to 2000, rising from about 23 to 1 to about 36 to 1. Some have used such data to claim, among other things, that globalization increases the economic inequality between prosperous and poverty-stricken nations. But the directly opposite conclusion would be reached when comparing the same set of nations in 2000 as in 1960. The income ratio between the initially richest 20 nations and the initially poorest 20 declined from 23 to 1 to less than 10 to 1. Freer and rising amounts of international trade, globalization, was in fact one of the reasons why some nations rose out of the bottom 20. Since all countries around the world began poor, what requires an explanation is not why there is poverty, but how some countries rose out of poverty to become prosperous. No one knows who invented the wheel or what individual first began to plant crops instead of relying on gathering the spontaneous produce of nature. What is known is that such things appeared in some societies long before they appeared in others, and that they spread from one society to another, though not to all. The earliest known agriculture appeared in the Middle East and spread into those European societies located nearest the Middle East. Thus, Mediterranean Europe, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, was much more advanced in many ways than Northern Europe. The ancient Greeks built magnificent structures such as the Parthenon, but there was not a single building in the British Isles centuries later when the Romans invaded. As Winston Churchill said, quote, "We owe London to Rome," end quote. As late as the 10th century AD, a Muslim scholar could say that Europeans grow more pale the farther north they are, and also that the, quote, farther they are to the north, the more stupid, gross, and brutish they are, end quote. However much such talk would be automatically dismissed as racism today, the fact is that he was there and we were not. Moreover, the enormous retrogression throughout Western Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire lasted many centuries before the countries of Western Europe emerged as the new leaders of European civilization, displacing the countries of the Mediterranean Europe. In Asia as well, the ancient civilization that developed around China's Yellow River spread not only across China but into other parts of Southeast Asia and to some extent Japan, and the products of China spread across the Eurasian landmass into Europe. Places cut off from advances in the various leading civilizations of the world, whether for geographic or other reasons, tended to lag behind and to remain at levels of poverty that the more dynamic economies were leaving behind. 17th century Japan adopted a national policy of deliberate isolation from the outside world that lasted until American warships entered Japanese water in the middle of the 19th century and forced the Japanese to open their ports to the world. This painful episode provided a revelation to the Japanese of their own backwardness and weakness, creating an agenda of national economic development that dominated the country for generations to come. Here was one of the rare examples of a country which saw in itself the sources of its own poverty, and therefore need to change themselves in order to advance. Having never been conquered at that time, they could not blame colonialism, and having been isolated from international commerce and investment, they could not blame quote-unquote exploitation by foreigners. Operating on a vision radically different from that of many third world nations today, Japan had one of history's most rapid and dramatic rises from poverty and backwardness. In terms of leadership in science, technology, economic and political organization, and the arts, China was the leading nation in the world longer than any other nation in any other period of history. As late as the Middle Ages, China had the highest standard of living in the world. Yet in more recent centuries, China has usually been a third world nation, where recurrent famines took millions of lives, and only since the last quarter of the 20th century has an accelerated growth rate begun to lift China out of that condition. Similarly, for centuries beginning in the Middle Ages, the Islamic world was well ahead of Europe in science, the arts, and militarily. But here too the relative positions of these two civilizations have reversed across a broad spectrum of social endeavors. In short, no nation or civilization has been permanently in the forefront of human advancement. But what has also never happened has been an economic equality across the spectrum of nations that many today regard as a norm, whose absence requires special and perhaps sinister explanations. That concludes today's read. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So the sum of this part of the chapter, the main question that this chapter in general, but especially this part of the chapter is trying to answer is, why are some nations poor, or what more better, why are some nations poorer than others? So this can easily be explained, at least in part, without any sort of reference to some sort of nefarious activity or behavior. This is not to dismiss the evils of the past, and this is not what Thomas Sowell's intent was when he was talking about histories, when he was using climate and geography and history to explain why you would never expect civilizations to be on equal standing when it comes to standard of living and in technology and GDP per capita. You'd never expect equal outcomes in that regard. This isn't to dismiss the evils of the past. Sowell doesn't want to do that. And by the way, this isn't to dismiss the evils of the past that every civilization ever engaged in to some degree. The point is actually brought up by Thomas Sowell on page 194, which extends into 195. What is important to understand, what is important is to understand that geography alone is enough to preclude any inherent economic sameness or equality among peoples or nations from being used as a benchmark or general presumption that would lead us to be shocked that there are differences and to look for mysterious or sinister reasons for those differences. So what he's basically saying is we don't have to go to try to find sinister reasons for why some nations are richer or poorer than others. It could be easily explained by something as innocuous as geography, and very often the attempts made here are to completely ignore or dismiss the effects of something like geography. The other thing he points out is that what's really important in answering this question is that this question is kind of poorly framed. What reason would there be for identical equality given certain factors in terms of economics? Sowell brings this up again on page 198. But what has also never happened has been an economic equality across the spectrum of nations that many today regard as a norm whose absence requires special or perhaps sinister explanations. So again, what we need to do is not explain what we would want to do is explain why some why some civilizations and nations would be on equal standing in terms of economics, because the norm is actually, the default position is, the natural state, if you will, is economic inequality. And I'll come right out and say what Sowell I don't think is actually going to ever really say in this chapter, and definitely did not say in this read. And one of those key factors, and I would argue the key factor, is culture. Now, I know what a lot of people who might have opposition to that claim would say, well, what is culture? So the dictionary definition, and it's based on the dictionaries that are on my shelf right now that I just pulled off the shelf and wrote down, is the totality of socially transmitted behavior patterns. So the definition from the dictionary is the totality of socially transmitted behavior patterns, arts, beliefs, institutions, and all other products of human work and thought characteristic of a community or population. I think that kind of goes a bit too far for me, and also in some ways not far enough. I would prefer the definition of, and this is my definition, what I think Sowell would agree with, would I think be a better definition for what we're describing here: the sum of the values, beliefs, mores, norms, traditions, and customs that come to define a group of people. And those things can thus encompass and include language. This is the factor that, and when Thomas Sowell talks about Singapore and Japan on page 197, this is the factor that's missing here, where you can't possibly blame Japan's backwardness in the middle of the 19th century on imperialization or colonialization, because they were never colonized. They were always self-governed. At least internally, they were always self-governed, with the exception being a short period after World War II when there was basically a proxy state for the United States for a few years, a puppet state, if you will, of the United States for about a year or two until the U.S. occupation of Japan waned. The same thing is true of Singapore in the 20th century. How did Singapore go from being super, 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 super poor in the middle of the 20th century to suddenly being ultra super rich? How did they get there? They're surrounded by a country that is still to this day quite poor. They're surrounded by countries beyond that are still to this day quite poor. There has never been a time where they were one of the most colonized countries on Earth for basically the totality of their existence. They were either a colony of, before the European colonial era, they were a colony of the mainland countries that seemed to be able to conquer the Southeast Asia and Polynesia. They were always under somebody else's rule. In fact, for many years, they were under what was effectively Chinese rule. And to this, again, all of a sudden, those colonial powers, if you will, those imperial powers left, and unlike every other country on Earth, Singapore got super rich. How? They have virtually no natural resources. They're a tiny country. They're a horribly mountainous country. There's no fertile plain for them to grow food on. There's no fertile plain for them to have their own breadbasket. They have to import everything. And one of the things that they were willing to do was import, again, the values, beliefs, mores, norms, traditions, and customs that allowed them to enter into a world of prosperity. It's the same thing's true of a place like Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein is a tiny landlocked country that has no natural resources for all intents and purposes, and yet is ultra super rich, and is actually richer than even the countries in its immediate vicinity: Switzerland, Austria, even Germany and Italy. Luxembourg is the same. Luxembourg is actually significantly richer than Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. And it's, again, a tiny landlocked country with very limited natural resources, yet it's routinely considered the richest country on Earth. So the thing that must differentiate Luxembourg from Germany cannot possibly be its natural resources, and France cannot possibly have anything to do with climate. It has to be something internal to the people that are there, that differentiates those people, that has come to define that group of people. And that element, of course, that missing thing is culture. So again, this isn't me saying that culture explains everything, but to me, this is the key factor in bringing economic prosperity to a group of people in the way that we view economic prosperity today. The other thing that needs to get pointed out, and Sowell brings this up, is that the framing of the question, why are some nations poorer than others, is flawed from the get-go. The natural state not only isn't economic inequality, it's poverty, not prosperity. He points this out. We've talked about this a lot in this and many other reads. Sowell points this out on page 196. What requires an explanation is not why there is poverty, but how some countries rose out of poverty to become prosperous. This was the whole purpose. This was at least largely the purpose of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. Forgive me, folks. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. And we're going to get we're going to make a few more references to this book, but the point of the wealth of nations and not the poverty of nations is that it's wealth and prosperity that needs to be explained, not poverty. You strip a man of everything that he possesses, including the clothes on his back, and hurl him onto an island, he will be poor. If you do the same thing with another person and he will be equally poor, if you do that enough times and all of a sudden you see what you'll wind up seeing is one or two of these one-man islands suddenly become quote unquote rich. They look like the Swiss Family Robinson. What made them get there? If all other things are being controlled for, how did they get rich? And that's not to say that there is an explanation. That's to say that what would need to be explained in that situation is how did that naked man on that island become the Swiss Family Robinson? Why didn't he just die 6 months later like 3/4 of the rest of these people? Why isn't he still scraping the shoreline for mussels and crabs? Right? Why is he able to go fish? Why is he able to harvest crops? How is it that he's getting fat off the land quite literally and everyone else is genuinely starving for years on end if they haven't died already? The Wealth of a Nation also helps to answer the primary question itself. Sowell asked this on page 189. Excuse me here. But despite similar examples that could be cited in various parts of the world, the more fundamental question remains, and that is, why most prosperous countries today are prosperous and why most poor countries are poor. And Sowell is alluding to something that I think Smith does a great job of explaining. So this is not a single factor. However, the answer to this question is not a single factor. However, one of the things to look at that's really important is how it is that Spain squandered its riches from conquest. And again, Portugal did the same thing. And The Wealth of Nations, and Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations spends almost an entire book explaining how it is that Spain, despite the tremendous amount of gold it was bringing in from these countries it was conquering, wound up completely squandering it. Why is it that Germany, that engaged in virtually no colonialism, that extracted almost nothing from those other countries, is way better off than Spain? England too. England, when it sent its colonists over to the New World, to the West, did virtually none of what Spain did and extracted virtually none of the West's gold. And yet they immediately supplanted Spain during the colonial era as not only the great, as the wealthiest nation in the world, but also as the great conquerors of the world, the great military power. The British Empire was the go-to power, was the defining world superpower in the immediate aftermath of Spain's conquest of Central and South America. So this is something that can't just be explained by guns, germs, and steel. Especially now that every country in the world has all three, why are some of these countries still not improving? And again, this isn't just skin color, right? But there's a reason some countries have declined over the last 25 years, Venezuela coming to mind. And you can't explain the growth, again, of Singapore over the last 50 years with, again, just guns, germs, and steel, or the perennial the perennial blame, which is just whiteness, or white colonization, or whatever. You can't explain the growth of Singapore with this. You can't explain the squandering of the riches of Spain with all of this. You can't explain how it is that Spain was able to do that in the first place. Why was it that Spain was the conquering nation of the world for hundreds of years? How did they get to that point in the first place? How were they able to do that in the first place? And some of that is, as he points out, just simply a matter of not only history, but simpler than that, geography. The point is that the knee-jerk reaction of, you can't just knee-jerk the answer to this question to nefarious activity like white supremacy or colonialism or something. White supremacy being an idea that really was born out of an excuse in the early 19th century for slaveholders in the South to continue holding slaves. So you really can't even explain it from that standpoint anyways, because this notion of the white race being the superior race really didn't come to the fore again until until several years into the early part of the 19th century, and it evolved only in the American South. And again, was a lame excuse for the Southerners to continue to have, who were slave owners, to continue to have slavery. They were people, yes, but they were lesser people, if you will. That was their excuse. So I wish that, and this is going to be a little bit of a critique here, I wish that Sowell explained what he meant by the difference between blame and causality. I wish he would explain what he means by blame. I think that's what he's talking about, this knee-jerk reaction to jump to the conclusion that it must be the evil whiteness that is causing countries that are poor to be poor. It is the evil white man that is keeping down all of these other countries, or has kept down all of these other countries, or at some point brought down all of these other countries. And again, he brings up the case of Israel. Why is it that Israel is a beacon of hope in a world where it's in a region of the world that is just like nonstop destitute? Every other country in that region is absolutely destitute, and then there's this little blip called Israel, which is super rich. With the exception, of course, of, to a much lesser extent, places like the UAE, Bahrain, and Qatar, which again are little dots on the Arabian Peninsula, which I would attribute in this case to actual market economies. But I wish that he would have actually, in the beginning of this chapter, explain what he meant by blame and explain what he meant by the difference between blame and causality. But I think that's what he's going for. There's another quick point to be made here that Sowell, I think he wanted to allude to, but never really made. And that's the difference between the values of equality and freedom. So these are conflicting values. You can't have absolute equality in terms at least of outcome, or expect that, and also have freedom. In this case, one of the things that you want to value if you want to see prosperity is the freedom to prosper, is the freedom to do the things that would make you better off than you currently are. These goals and values are at complete odds with each other. And to suggest that you can have freedom and equality, I don't think is possible. There's the folks over at the podcast, the Lotus Eaters, have spent a long time going over all of this. I don't have time to get into detail in this matter, but it's something to keep in mind since this is supposed to be kind of an introductory level lesson in economics, when you're doing your research, when you're learning, when you're reading more about economics, remember that this notion of equality and as a value exists in stark contrast to the value of freedom. You can't have absolute freedom and absolute equality. It's just not possible to do. The last thing I want to go over real quick, and this is going to be real quick, and this is going to be bizarre than what I'm about to do. I understand. But, Sowell brings up a point that ideas tend to travel and exchange better and more quickly and more efficiently, more easily in an east-west direction than they do in a north-south direction. So in order to illustrate that point, let me get this centered. In order to illustrate that point, what we are actually going to do is we're going to go to civilization. So this is Civilization 2, the game. I have no better way of presenting what he means by all of this than to do this. So you'll have to excuse the visual here. But the idea is that when you have, let's say you have the horses of Mongolia. So let's go over to where Mongolia is. So Mongolia is like somewhere around here, right? So that's where we think horses came from. Well, that fauna and the flora that it survives on are specific basically to that latitude. And what you're going to find is that as long as you stay in this latitude, right, you can get from the eastern part of Asia all the way over to the western part of Europe and not really significantly change the general geography, climate, etc. that you're experiencing there, which means that you can find the similar characteristics in terms of flora and fauna. It also means that you can find similar characteristics in climate. So if you're an early human being and you have your horses, well, you know that the horses can survive as long as they stay on this grain route that allows them to eat whatever grasses are in the east, whatever grasses are in the Middle East, whatever grasses are in Southeast Europe, and then whatever grasses are in Western Europe. And you know that they're going to be consistently huge fields of grasses along that latitude. So what you're dealing with here is you have a culture in the West who has a group of people that have experience with that flora and that fauna, and thus when it comes to traveling on foot or on horseback or on camelback or however you wind up traveling, you have familiarity with this geography along that stretch. So we can actually get from, well, this is a bad example, but you can, this is, and I'll have to go, you'll have to just trust me on this because, here, let's do that. No, because we can't bring up any other windows, but this is tile number 135 in the X direction and 43 in the Y direction. So if we follow that all the way out to the west, we can get to, that is 74. So 135 minus 74 is 61. What would 61 in the vertical element look like? Well, this is as far north as we can get before we start getting into some pretty cold climates. That's Y16. So we got to get to Y77 to get that equivalent. And now Y77 is, all the way down here. So we're looking at the sub-Saharan African plain. So what you would have to do then is you'd have to cross, this is a bit of, so the map isn't perfect, but we've got, we would know to be taiga in northwestern Russia as we go through the plains, and then we go through the Middle East where there is desert, and then we get to the sub-Saharan African plain. So in that same distance, we have to learn how to navigate the flora and fauna of the desert, which is a lot of learning succulents. It's a lot of horses aren't going to do well in the desert, but camels will. So you'd have to know that. It's a lot of virtually every snake is venomous in the desert, so you'd have to be aware of that. Even if you follow the Nile River, you're dealing with crocodiles, something that in Europe doesn't exist, something that in the northern Chinese plain doesn't exist, right? Something that in these more mountainous regions in the stands, if you will, the Tajikistans, Kyrgyzstans, Turkmenistans, doesn't exist for all intents and purposes until you get to the Caspian Sea. But for all intents and purposes, you're not dealing with crocodiles. And that's not to say that crocodiles are more difficult to deal with. It's just it's another consideration you're going to have to make that you don't have to make in those plains. So the same thing is true in North and South America. And this is part of why those cultures never really evolved beyond the Stone Age. Because you can see here in North America that we can get from what I'm guessing is New Brunswick all the way out to Seattle we have to traverse those Rocky Mountains right there. But the idea is that in an east-westerly direction, you're not really changing much in terms of geography and climate. But in a north-south direction, the same distance, which is, let's see, what our X is 36 and our X is 8. So that'd be 24. So if we went from Central Texas, that's Y of 48. So we need to get to 72. 72 would put us 72 would put us in Colombia. So we would have to get through a desert, a plain, some mountains, a jungle. And yeah, to get to that same distance that we talked about here in the Eurasian plain, that's 61, we can go from the Pentanal here at 91, we go up to a Y of 30. So that would be what? Right there. So yeah, in that same distance, we've got to go from the Pentanal through the jungle, over the mountains, through another jungle, across a desert, and across the plain before we get into the northern plains, and where you're running into really brutal winters, and you're running into a totally different type of forest that you would run to in the jungle. So that is the best I can do to explain what Sowell means when he's talking about how these sort of things travel easier from east to west than they do from north to south. That's the best I can do to explain why, an idea might be easier to do trade with China if you're living in France in, say, the year 1200 than it would be to do the same thing with like Central Africa at this point. Because even though the distance as the crow flies is way, way less, you have to cross a desert, you have to go into the jungle. And not only are they more formidable climates and geographies to have to traverse, you need to have that experience with those different climates and the flora and the fauna that you're going to run into in order to safely traverse them. So hopefully that explains what he was talking about there the best I can. We will continue in our next read in Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies with the section within Chapter 7 entitled Economics. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.